Testing operator line. Testing 1 2 3 1 2 3. Operator line 1 2 3.
Okay, I hear the telephone loud and clear. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great, thank you. I'll give you a quick check while you're there.
One of the TX lines. Yeah, podium. Oh, no, not TVs behind me.
Okay, ready?
Podium with flags.
Okay, checking audio for the media. Checking 1 2 3 4. Checking 5 6 7 8 9 10. 10 9 8 7 6 5 4 3 2. You getting it okay? Perfect.
Okay.
Not sure if Brandon needs.
Check 1 2 1 2 3 4 5 6. This is a lip sync for pool. Yeah, you're good.
Sorry, I should have let you know as well.
How are you?
Oh, good.
And thank you for joining us for an important announcement about Alberta's economic recovery plan. I'm glad to be here with David McLean, Alberta Vice President of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, joining us on this important day as we begin the fall sitting of Alberta's legislature. We all know how our province has been hit by a triple whammy over the last 20 months, the global COVID-19 pandemic, plus the biggest contraction of the world economy in almost a century, and on top of that, last year's total collapse in energy prices hitting our province hard. But in recent months, we've begun seeing strong signs of economic recovery and growth. Last month, Alberta added 20,000 net new jobs, just as we did the month before. In fact, 3 consecutive months of significant job growth and some 90,000 net new jobs created so far in our province since the beginning of the year. This has led to Alberta gaining back all jobs lost since the start of the pandemic, and we are experiencing the second fastest job growth in the Federation. We're seeing major investments and growth in emerging industries across the province, like film and television, tech and digital innovation, clean technology, and so much more. Since introducing the film and television tax credit last year, Alberta has seen nearly $1 billion of investment flood into our province for major big budget productions like, for example, HBO's The Last of Us. We've seen tech giants like Infosys, and Amazon choose Alberta to expand their businesses, taking advantage of our low taxes and our cost of living, along with a wealth of tech talent in our workforce. And there are more very exciting announcements to come in that industry, together with the announcements of RBC and Rogers that they'll be establishing large tech talent centres here in Alberta. But just 2 weeks ago, we learned that Dow Chemicals, one of the world's largest companies, will build the world's first net zero ethylene cracker right here in Alberta, a multi-billion-dollar investment that will create thousands of high-paying new jobs. This will likely be the largest single job-creating investment in Alberta in more than a decade, and the largest in Western Canada in a decade, with the exception of LNG Canada on the West Coast. And after enduring a total collapse of energy prices last year, our oil and gas industry is surging again, with ATB reporting last week that oil production in Alberta has never been higher. In fact, we recently had the highest ever level of exports at 4 million barrels a day. And by the completion, I should say, of Enbridge's Line 3 expansion this month, the discount on Alberta oil prices is low, with Western Canada Select prices trading at over $70 a barrel today. And just last Friday, I was on the phone with the CEOs of the major oil sand companies who assured me that that will be translating into additional job-creating capital investment in the year to come. However, all of this growth, all of this good news has created a new challenge, a good challenge. As the economy rebounds and investment dollars are pouring back into Alberta rather than fleeing the province, we have to make sure that we have enough skilled workers to keep moving forward. Over the past month, I've met with nearly 20 major industry associations, which collectively include, and we've spoken to hundreds of Alberta's largest employers through their industry associations. All of these groups report that the single biggest challenge they are now facing is a shortage of workers, which I know is a paradox because we still have 8% unemployment, and our number one focus has to be getting those folks back to work. That means bringing this investment here and ensuring that we have a workforce in the future to address the challenge of economic growth. A labour shortage could stop our economic momentum in its tracks, which we must avoid. And that's why today I'm proud to be here with Minister of Labour and Immigration, Tyler Shandro, to announce a key part of Alberta's response to this developing challenge. And that's Bill 49, the Labour Mobility Act, which we're introducing into the legislature today. It will make it faster and easier for skilled professionals and trades workers who are certified in other Canadian provinces to get their credentials recognized here in Alberta automatically. If passed, this legislation will make it easier for workers like, for example, optometrists, engineers, accountants, vets, architects, dentists, tradespeople, and dozens of other occupations to bring their expertise their experience, their education, their work ethic, and their families from across Canada to Alberta, no matter where in the country they earn their credentials. And let me pause there to say that the single greatest engine of economic growth and diversification of Alberta's economy in recent decades has been population growth, people choosing to become Albertans. Yes, people from around the world immigrating here, but also, of course, hundreds of thousands of Canadians who moved to great opportunity, lower taxes, a better, higher quality of life. They came to embrace the Alberta advantage. And we have a strong incentive to further knock down barriers to mobility of skilled workers, and that's why we're introducing the Labour Mobility Act, which will affect more than 100 regulated occupations in a wide range of sectors across Alberta's economy. This will be a growth opportunity for job creators in sectors where there simply are not enough skilled Albertans. In turn, having the necessary skills and talent in our province will make Alberta a more attractive destination for not just workers, but for investment and businesses. Because when I talk to companies like Dow, one of their primary concerns now is whether we will have enough skilled workers to actually meet the demands of growth. I hope this will also be the start of a broader national effort to knock down trade and employment barriers that hamstring Canada's economy to the tune of billions of dollars a year. Occupations are regulated inconsistently across Canada, creating a patchwork of credential recognition that holds back skilled and certified workers. Many of them face additional educational, examination, training requirements, basically red tape if they want to get a job in a different province. That's time, money, and talent that is wasted. In fact, internal barriers to free trade within Canada may cost our economy as much as $130 billion a year, according to some studies, with barriers to labour mobility being one of the costliest elements of restrictions within Canada. A recent study that we commissioned from the C.D. Howe Institute estimates that improving labour mobility could add up to $2.8 billion a year to Alberta's economy. And an earlier Conference Board of Canada report from 2015 estimated that Canada's economy nationally could expand by up to $17 billion if we were to improve the country's learning recognition system. Now, back in July of 2019, when I met with my fellow premiers, I announced that Alberta was going to take dramatic and bold leadership in promoting free trade within Canada, announcing at the Council of the Federation that we were unilaterally lifting 80% of Alberta's exceptions under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, and including all of our exceptions on government procurement. And I did it to challenge the other provinces to follow suit. I also put them on notice that we were going to look at unilateral recognition of credentials for trades and professions issued by other provinces across the country. And that's exactly what we have done. That's led to the introduction of this bill here today. So I'm challenging my fellow premiers and other provinces to reciprocate what we are doing today. I'm sending letters to all provincial premiers, encouraging them to follow Alberta's lead in tearing down these barriers and unlocking the vast potential in Canada's workforce. Because if you can move between the nearly 30 countries of the European Union as a skilled worker without running into burdensome red tape, why can't you do it within the 10 provinces of Canada? I believe Canada's premiers must come together on this critical issue to strengthen not only our national economy, but the bonds of national unity. So the Labour Mobility Act is just one part of our strategy to ensure that we have a growing skilled workforce as we enter a period of strong economic growth. This strategy includes the Jobs Now program, which, with a $200 million contribution from Alberta, brings us to the largest ever government investment in skills training in partnership with the private sector, and we'll be having an announcement in the days to come about its expansion. It's also in addition to the Skills for Jobs agenda, where we are putting a much stronger emphasis in our high schools, colleges and universities, our post-secondary institutions, on practical learning to prepare young people for the jobs of the future, things like micro-credentials and apprenticeship programs, co-op programs, and experiential learning. It's also in addition to the Alberta Advantage Immigration Strategy that we ran on, and which is reforming Alberta's immigration program, and there will be more news about that in the weeks to come. On top of our Fairness for Newcomers strategy, which is knocking down barriers to the ability of immigrants from abroad to get their credentials and education recognized to work productively here in Canada at their skill level. All of this is part of Alberta's broader economic recovery plan, a bold and ambitious plan to create thousands of new jobs and diversify our economy. And as I say, that plan is working. The majority of economists have projected that we are leading Canada in economic growth, and we'll do so again next year. We are attracting job-creating private sector investment from across the country and around the world to make Alberta's economy the most competitive in North America. We're taking action to ensure that our workforce is getting the skills for the 21st century and beyond, so that every Albertan has the opportunity to choose their path, to grow our economy, to realize their potential. We're building on our strong foundation as a responsible and innovative energy leader and a major global source of high-quality ag and forestry products. From rural broadband and once-in-a-generation irrigation projects to shovel-ready transportation and healthcare projects and schools, we're building the infrastructure we need for our future economy. And we're providing the tangible support that Alberta businesses and families need to get back to work and thrive as our economy recovers and grows. So today we're taking an important, I think an historic step to support strong recovery and future growth by taking this bold leadership action effectively to tell our professional regulatory organizations to recognize immediately the credentials of people from across the country. So with that, I will hand it over to Minister Shandro to offer more details. I think we'll also be hearing from David McLean from the Manufacturers and Exporters. Then we'll be happy to take your questions.
Good afternoon. Thanks very much for joining us for this important announcement today. As the Premier mentioned, this is about responding to, about adapting to the challenging economic times that we find ourselves in today. And it's never been more important than now to make sure, as a government, that we are doing everything in our power, making Alberta a magnet for investment, to break down barriers that prevent the free flow of labor and trade, and confront the looming labor shortage that we now see worldwide head on, so that our economy can recover and grow. And the Labour and Mobility Act is going to be a critical part of that work. If passed, the Act will help ensure that our economy remains competitive on a global stage. And it's going to help ensure that we attract the necessary skills, the necessary talent for businesses and communities to grow, for them to succeed. And it'll do that by streamlining our processes, reducing red tape, introducing clear and uniform legislative requirements for Alberta's regulatory authorities. More specifically, the Act will make Alberta the first and the only jurisdiction in Canada to legislate timelines for registration decisions. Regulatory authorities will be required to look at applicants and give registration decisions within 20 days. And that means that if someone is certified as a professional and they submit the necessary documents and they meet all of the requirements, they can expect to get to work within 1 month upon applying. The Act will also require regulatory authorities to establish streamlined internal review and appeal processes within reasonable timeframes. Next, the Act will limit the documents required to evaluate the credentials of an out-of-province worker to include proof of certification in a Canadian jurisdiction and any other documents stated in the regulation. Further to our commitment to transparency, the Act will require regulatory authorities to make information on required documents and fees available to the public. So, for example, regulatory authorities may post this information on their websites. And this is another step to help make sure that our processes in Alberta are seamless and clear. Under the Act, we are also outlining what actions and offenses and their associated penalties would be. And this includes actions like failing to register eligible applicants or failing to meet the legislative processing times. Together, these actions will significantly reduce red tape and create a streamlined, create a consistent, and create a transparent approach for recognizing the skills, the education, and the credentials of out-of-province certified professional workers. But rest assured, this will not come at the expense of maintaining Alberta's high professional standards. And that's why in cases where regulated occupations are significantly different from the same occupation in another province, recognition will be restricted until that distinction is properly evaluated by the regulatory authority. And this will ensure that out-of-province certified professional workers have the equivalent skills to perform that occupation here in Alberta. Public safety will always remain #1 priority for us in this government. And when taken together, these actions will help Alberta to break down the barriers which restrict the movement of people and goods to our province. And this is critical to ensure that we have we continue to attract much-needed investment to our province, which will support our economic recovery and our future growth. And this will support our ultimate goal, to make Alberta among the fastest-moving, freest economies in North America. And under the leadership of the Premier, Alberta has and will continue to take bold action to make this a reality. And finally, I'd like to echo the Premier in thanking Alberta's regulatory authorities for their input in this process and for their support in the development of this Act. Alberta's government is committed to continuing this work together, ensuring that our economy meets the needs of our job creators and workers and all Albertans. Thank you very much. I'd like to now invite David McLean, who is the Vice President of the Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters.
Thank you, Minister Shandro. It's great to be here today. Every year, CME surveys our members, Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters surveys our members, and we ask them what their top challenges are. What are the things that keep them up at night? And every year, the attraction and retention of skilled labor ranks as a top concern. And that's not a new thing. That's been decades in the making. The legislation announced today acknowledges that challenge. We applaud the Alberta government for making this move. Now, for our part, manufacturers have done their part to diversify their workplaces, to attract traditionally underrepresented groups to the field of manufacturing. We've increased wages across the board in a bid to attract the best and brightest from around the world. But it's still a challenge. And manufacturers quite simply need every tool at their disposal to meet the needs of growth, to grow the sector in the future. So on behalf of Canadian Manufacturers and Exporters, I'd like to thank Premier Kenney and Minister Shandro for bringing this legislation forward. And we wholeheartedly support this legislation. Thank you.
All right, thank you. We're now going to move over to a media Q&A. Just a reminder to folks who have shown up in person, we do have a mic set up for you to ask your questions into. At that mic, please say your name, the news outlet you're with, as well as who you're directing your question to. And a reminder that any questions on the Labour Mobility Act related to it are under an embargo until that legislation is tabled in the House. And with that, we just have a couple of folks online who are take first, and then we'll grab the folks who are here in person. With that, operator, can you please put through our first question?
Our first question comes from Don Braid of the Calgary Herald.
Premier, this is not on the topic, but I'll ask it very quickly. When do you plan to proclaim the Recall Act?
Don, some point in the next few weeks, where Justice Department lawyers are completing the draft regulations to allow for it to be proclaimed. And I just got an update that they hope to be done within the next few weeks, so I hope sometime in November. That was always our intention, and just waiting for the final draft of the regulations.
Okay, Don, do you have a follow-up?
Yes. Is this measures you're taking today is it more imperative now that Alberta is for a long time, we didn't have to work too hard to get people to come here, but now it's harder and people are actually net leaving in some places. Is this more imperative now than it has been in recent years?
Well, I would say probably not as imperative as it was during the last boom. I remember I was the federal employment minister in that period, 2013, 2015, and as you know, there were huge labor and skill shortages across the Alberta economy, and I was trying hard then as the federal minister to get provinces to knock down these barriers for labor mobility. Some progress was made. Some progress has been made under the Canada Free Trade Agreement, under the New West Partnership Agreement, but it's not enough. And now as we are moving, I believe, probably into a strong and sustained cycle of economic growth, and we are hearing about labor shortages, not just in Alberta, but across the economy in North America. This is going to become an emerging challenge. I really believe that part of the Alberta spirit is that we are free traders. And that's why doing this unilaterally makes sense. In fact, the conference board study, the C.D. Howe report that we released earlier this year confirms that Alberta is a big net winner when it comes to interprovincial migration. Now, Don, I don't. One part of your question there, I don't necessarily agree with, is the assertion that we've been losing people. In fact, last year in 2020, when we had the hardest hit economy in the country, we saw actually the highest population growth. We were one of only 2 provinces with net population growth. It is true that I think we lost something like 2,000 people on net interprovincial migration that year. Given the depth of what I call double recession in 2020, I think that was remarkable. But what I'm hearing now, anecdotally, we haven't seen this confirmed yet in Stats Can data, but when I speak to, for example, the housing builders in Alberta, they're telling me that they can't build fast enough for the new demand. And in fact, one of the Calgary's largest developers told me last week that he estimates there's like 100 families every week moving here from Ontario, and that houses are flying off the shelf, so to speak. I think that a lot of that is being driven by the cost of living differential. Real estate prices have reached an absurd level in other places like Vancouver and Toronto, such that it's virtually impossible for middle-class families to buy a starter home, and so I think the Alberta advantage on the cost of living, the cost of housing, will increasingly be a magnet, as will stronger levels of economic growth. So, yeah, I think that this is good timing for this. Frankly, I wish this had been done some time ago. We had this legislation ready to roll in a year ago, but we decided to keep it on the shelf because we were still struggling with the COVID recession. But we think the timing is optimal now that we're moving into a strong period of growth.
Okay, we have time for 2 more calls before finishing all the folks in line here. So, operator, can you please put through our next call?
Ashley Joanno, Post Media.
Hi, I think this is probably a question for the Premier. You talk about wanting to streamline the process for what regulatory bodies need to look at to approve someone, but we haven't gotten any details yet about what that's actually going to look like because it'll all be part of regulations that haven't been written yet. Can you give me some sort of sense or some sort of examples of what you're actually going to be looking for in these regulations and how they'll be different from what it looks like right now?
Sure. Well, there are a lot of specifics in the bill, and I hope we're providing that to reporters on embargo. I hope so. Let me just give you some of the specifics. First of all, Section 2 requires that the regulators, these are the professional trade regulators, comply with the domestic trade agreements in force. So that would include the New West Partnership as well as the Canada Free Trade Agreement. And we've never made this a statutory, a requirement in law for them to comply. I think that's an obligation that's been on the province, but we really need to move that obligation onto the regulators who actually exercise the authority over applicants for credentialing. Secondly, we make it very plain in law now. A regulatory body has a duty to carry out registration practices and decisions in respect of labour mobility applicants, those would be Canadians coming here, that are transparent, objective, impartial, and procedurally fair. There's now a clear legal standard, if this is passed, that they've got to be transparent, impartial, and fair on those interprovincial migrants. Section 7 says that where a labor mobility applicant has provided proof of certification to a regulatory body and has met all of the other requirements, the body shall register that labor mobility applicant without restrictions, limitations, or conditions. So this is basically saying that as long as the person submits the required proof of a dentist comes from Nova Scotia, as long as they submit the necessary proof of their professional qualifications, that the Alberta Dentist College must recognize that effectively automatically. And we put in very tight and specific timelines here in Section 8 that 10 business days after making a registration decision, basically it says, that the regulatory body shall within 10 business days provide written acknowledgement of the application. Then they have 20 days after that, after receiving the application, to make a decision, and they have then maximum of 10 days to inform the person. So basically, we're saying to the roughly 100 regulatory bodies for professions and trades in Alberta, you can't sit on the file for more than a month. This is moving what has sometimes been a 6 or a 12-month process down to a maximum of 40 days. So, and the clear direction in this legislation is like, and here's the point: when you're an Albertan and if you get sick in BC or Saskatchewan, you don't ask to see whether the doctor or the nurse is certified by their Alberta regulator. You just trust that other Canadian professionals are operating at effectively the same high and safe standard. And so what we're saying through this legislation is, let's stop second-guessing each other in Canada. There will be some areas that we still need to work on, where professions in other provinces may have a significantly different scope of practice. The example of dental hygienists, I believe, in some provinces they could administer a local anesthetic. In other provinces they can't. So there may be some need for continued work on regulatory harmonization amongst the different trades and professions. But basically, I think this is very specific with the maximum 40-day timeline between receipt of application and informing the applicant.
And Ashley, do you have a follow-up at all?
And this press conference has talked about how mobility will add $2.8 billion to the province's GDP. But if you actually look at the report that you're pulling that number out from, what it talks about is if the cost of moving to Alberta declines by 1/3 of 1%, that's right. What would add to the GDP. So I guess I don't understand how shortening the timeline for a yes or no answer in any way decreases the cost of living. Can you explain what I meant?
Well, the CD Howe report that we commissioned doesn't talk about, it's not about cost of living, it's about the transaction cost in moving. And if one of those transaction costs is that you can't get certified to work in your trade or profession, or it takes months or worse years to get that approval, then obviously that's a massive cost. So if we can move from a uncertain, opaque regulatory process to more or less European Union-style automatic and reciprocal recognition of Canadian credentials, that will be a game changer. And by the way, we are in not just a national, but a global labor force marketplace increasingly. And if we can go out to workers across the country and say, Alberta has the fastest and easiest process to recognize your credentials from another province, that gives us a competitive advantage. I think the point on the CD Howe estimate is it gives us a sense of just, first of all, how real the gains can be for our overall economy. And by the way, I would also point out that the Forum of Labour Market Ministers just issued a report earlier this month, which really underscores what we're trying to do here today. They say that red tape and administrative burden leads to delays and increased costs for certified workers seeking labour mobility. Varying occupational standards negatively impacts a worker's ability to receive full certificate-to-certificate recognition in all provinces, and many workers and employers are unaware of labor mobility opportunities, and they recommend that the governments work with regulatory authorities to encourage the reduction and streamlining of labor mobility application requirements for certified workers. That's exactly what we're doing here.
Okay, thank you. Operator, can you please put through our last call?
Chris Barco, Calgary Herald.
Hi, this is also a question for the Premier. Premier, will you be participating in any sense at all with the COP26 climate summit, which is going to begin at the end of this week in Scotland? And I guess I'm wondering whether you've had discussions with the federal government recently and what your position is on Ottawa's latest target tied to the Paris Accord, which I believe is a 40 to 45% GHG emissions reduction by 2030.
Well, the answer to the first question, Chris, is no. I won't be there. As you know, we're still in a state of public health emergency, and so we are not traveling unless it's absolutely essential. And I think just one more politician flying into a GabFest in Glasgow is not going to make any meaningful difference. But obviously, we have, on the second question, expressed great concern to the Government of Canada about its ever-changing targets. What we've been asking for, and I've said this to the Prime Minister since May of 2019, what we're asking for and what the Canadian energy industry is asking for is clarity and predictability when it comes to climate policy and its implications on our energy sector, the country's largest industrial sector. What concerns us is they almost seem to be improvising their targets. And it's very difficult, you know, as I always say to the Prime Minister and his cabinet ministers, you have zero chance of achieving your emissions targets, be they net zero or whatever, without the Alberta energy sector being full partners. And that's not simply going to happen by diktat. It's going to require cooperation. That's one of the reasons we made a huge push for a federal incentive for carbon capture, utilization, sequestration technology in the recent budget. We wait for the clarification. We're waiting for the clarification of who's in the federal cabinet to finalize the details of that. We are seeking a CCUS incentive which is at least as generous as the 45Q incentive that has massively expanded CCUS in the United States. We'd like it to be refundable, stackable, and also, of course, for it to apply to enhanced oil recovery. So those are the kinds of very practical things we're working on. Just last Friday, I met virtually with the major oil sands producers who constitute the Pathways Coalition. These companies collectively have committed themselves to a net zero emissions target by 2050. That's going to take massive investments in technology, game-changing technology. Alberta will be there to help and support that, but we need the federal government to be partners. Instead of just coming up with ever more ambitious targets, we actually need a game plan here. We want to be willing partners, but we need to have a real dialogue with the federal government because every other month they seem to come up with a new target.
And do you have a follow-up, Chris?
Yes, it's a two-part, Premier. I'm wondering, will the province look at adopting either a new emissions reductions target itself or a net zero emissions reduction target? That's the first question. The second one is I just wanted to ask you about what the federal government has told you with regards to funds or assistance for energy transition. In other words, for workers who are affected by the energy transition and maybe needing employment help in the future years or decades to come.
On the first question, yes, later this year, Minister of Environment and Parks, Jason Nixon, will be publishing Alberta's updated climate strategy, outlining our targets and strategies, working with industry to achieve those. So stay tuned on that. Secondly, with respect to the federal government's so-called just transition, I don't think there's anything just about telling 800,000 people that we don't value what they do and governments are going to try to undermine them and move them out of their high-paying jobs. So I fundamentally disagree with the whole premise of the federal Liberal government's so-called just transition. I'll tell you what is just is that the hundreds of thousands of jobs, high-paying jobs, that have been created. We're here talking about labor mobility today. The message I convey to the Prime Minister and his colleagues is this, that Alberta has been the great economic pressure release valve for workers in other parts of the country who are facing unemployment and even poverty, for unemployed Central Canadian manufacturing workers, for unemployed Newfoundland fishery workers, for unemployed BC forestry workers, and so many more who came to this province. And instead of facing the despair of underemployment or unemployment, in many cases ended up generating six-figure incomes and having incredible opportunities here. That is the nation-building role that Alberta has played in Canada's modern economy. And what we see now is a growing energy scarcity across the world because of the kind of policies that lie behind the so-called just transition. As energy prices are facing massive inflation that will drive more and more families in Europe and elsewhere into energy poverty, we need to have a realistic discussion about this. Yes, we need to embrace new technologies to reduce emissions, and we are and we will continue to do so. But in a world where there is a growing scarcity of traditional energy sources, Alberta can be part of that solution. So I kind of reject the premise of the whole just transition for workers. And no, we haven't heard anything about a strategy about how you would, take hundreds of thousands of people in high-paying occupations, and we've heard nothing about that. I mean, they did supply $200 million to match us on the Jobs Now program, which is a job training program, but we really see that as a bridge for people who are unemployed to get into work.
Okay, thank you. We'll now move to the questions here on the floor. We have Tom Vernon with Global News. Go ahead.
Hi, Premier. I want to get you on the previous move you made when it came to internal trade, removing 80% of the exceptions. You challenged other premiers to go ahead with that. Have any signaled that they were going to? And if not, are we not putting Alberta businesses at a disadvantage?
The answer, Tom, is only one province did, regrettably, follow our suit. That was Manitoba. They reduced a number of their exemptions after Alberta threw out that challenge in 2019. And I'm frustrated by that. I'm frustrated that we continue to live in an economically balkanized country where there's more free trade between the, I think, 28 member states of the European Union than the 10 Canadian provinces. I said to Prime Minister Trudeau when we first met in the spring of 19 that I thought the federal government had constitutional superpowers to knock down interprovincial trade barriers, and I would support them doing so to realize the dream of the economic union at Confederation. But the feds are not doing that, and so I do think, Tom, on your second part, it is clearly to our net advantage to knock down these barriers. Particularly on procurement. You ask about procurement. So yeah, we knocked down all of our restrictions on procurement that were in the Canada Free Trade Agreement. Well, what that means is we get more competition bidding for work in Alberta, which means lower costs for taxpayers. That's a positive. And finally, I would point out that Alberta is a major exporter of services like construction services with big companies here like PCL and others. And none of them have come to us to complain about taking a unilateral approach to this. I think they all realize the benefits of Alberta doing this, and Albertans are not afraid of competition.
I want to get you on the public inquiry report released last week. When you launched the public inquiry, you used language like knocking down misinformation. If any illegal activity is found, directing the government to, or directing action on that. In the end, there was no illegal activity found. There was no attempt to find any misinformation. And in fact, what it found was all they were doing was doing their free speech rights. Nothing was wrong. What did we get for $3.5 million?
Well, there's a difference between illegal and wrong. There are a lot of wrong things that may be legal. And I think it's wrong. It's wrong for billionaire foreign foundations to gang up on our economy. And their campaign killed pipelines, their campaign led to the loss of tens of thousands of energy jobs in this province. I think that's wrong. And that's why we threw the spotlight of transparency on them through the inquiry. I never alleged that there was criminality here. I do think that there are a lot of questions about the compliance with federal tax law for registered charities, which is one of the reasons the Harper government provided the Canada Revenue Agency with, I think, $10 million in the 2015 budget, better to investigate violations of the Tax Act with respect to illicit political activity supported by groups, by registered charities that are supposed to be limited in their political engagement. But then Prime Minister Trudeau came in and he instructed the CRA to down tools on that and then subsequently changed the law to allow registered charities to engage in, I think, virtually unlimited political work. So I guess retrospectively changing the charities law to bail out his friends from the Green Left organizations made that work legal, but I don't think it makes it right. I don't think charities should be able to be basically benefit from that privileged charitable tax credit while they're basically lobby organizations and political special interests. Anyway, I think the Allen inquiry did what we'd hoped it would do, which was to look at the data, to provide an objective and read on the campaign to landlock Alberta Energy. They identified $1.3 billion that came from those organizations over that period of time. And I think it validates what we've been saying from the very beginning about the high degree of coordination of those campaigns. So at the very least, what we have is a much greater degree of transparency, so we know what we're coping with. And I hope that those who are on the side of responsible development of our natural resources will learn some lessons from the Allen report.
Hi, Carly Robinson with City News. This will either be for the Minister or the Premier, whoever wants to take a stab at it. When we talk about worker shortages, lots of Albertans will be thinking about healthcare workers and what we saw this summer. So I'm wondering how this legislation would have made a difference in this summer if it had been in place a year ago.
Sure. Good question. So first of all, Alberta does have, on a per capita basis, more nurses and doctors than Canada. And they are generally better compensated than in other provinces. So in that sense, we don't have, we're somewhat better off when it comes to the total healthcare workforce here than other provinces. Secondly, all Canadian provinces have been coping with workforce challenges, healthcare workforce challenges through COVID, partly because so much of the COVID pressure has been on a relatively small portion of the. We have 111,000 employees at AHS, but we only have 850 registered nurses with ICU experience. So a great deal of the pressure has come down on that relatively small number of nurses, not just here, but elsewhere. Believe me, when I speak to other premiers, they're all coping with this challenge. So we need to address that challenge in the long term. That's a mandate I've given to Minister Copping. I will note that Alberta, I'm ashamed to say this, Alberta, under the Canada Free Trade Agreement, has filed more exemptions on labour mobility than any other province, and a lot of those exemptions deal with nurses. So what we are doing here today will actually eliminate those exemptions effectively and allow for greater labour mobility in recruiting nurses. I'll just share with you one of the complaints that I get from other provincial governments is they say, you and Alberta have always paid better salaries. British Columbia and Saskatchewan nurses and doctors keep coming here as a result. I think we see those salaries and wages coming closer together now. But if there's a nurse somewhere else in the country that wants to come and work in Alberta, it will be easier after this legislation.
Perfect. And you're encouraging other provinces to do the same. So what's going to be done to keep our nurses and doctors now that the salaries are closer from leaving?
Yeah.
Now that it's open?
Well, I would say we still want to offer generous and competitive rates. In fact, we are in collective bargaining with the Union of Nurses right now, and that is I can't comment further because we are in the midst of negotiations, but I can assure you that we are doing that in good faith, and that it's never been our goal to go below the national average of compensation, but to come somewhat closer to the national average, because we have typically been paying a 20% premium. So we will continue to offer very competitive and generous levels of compensation for our profoundly valued healthcare workers. And there are, of course, other benefits. I mean, if you're a nurse or a doctor in Alberta, you're living in and you move to Toronto or Vancouver, you can expect to pay 3 times more for the same house and pay higher taxes and have a higher cost of living. So I think the value proposition of the Alberta Advantage speaks for itself.
Okay, we have time for 2 more questions today. You can go ahead.
Sure. Shaylan Skalski, CTV News. I just want to talk about the timing. Premier, you spoke about this process previously in regards to the bill. The process previously taking regulatory bodies 6 to 12 months. Now we're talking about 20 business days. I'm just wondering how much consultation was done with these regulatory bodies to make sure this was realistic and done without compromising the process.
Fair question. So when I said 6 to 12 months, I said sometimes it can take that long. That's not an average. I don't actually know what the average is, because you're talking about roughly 100 regulators of trades and professions. And some of them, to their credit, have very good practices. Some of them are with the program in trying to help rather than hinder labor mobility. But that's not universally the case, and this sets a standard across all trades and professions. Now, we have received some feedback in our consultations. Former Minister of Labour, Jason Copping, and his department led consultations with the professional regulatory organizations last year, and some of them did say that they would prefer the flexibility they currently have to a kind of legal mandate and a legal timeline. And their argument was that every profession is different, and some have greater levels of complexity, and they're the experts, and they should know how long to take and what the process should be. We respect that, and we're not saying there shouldn't be a process, but we're just saying unless there's a really good reason to question the standards of another province, like they have a different scope of practice, this should be more or less automatic. And the model for this is what they do in the European Union. So, if you're a physician from Poland, you move to the United Kingdom, it's almost seamless. And I would just say, we have confidence of Canadian standards. When you go to Nova Scotia on holiday, you get a toothache, go to a dentist, you're not asking if they're registered in Alberta. So I don't think this will in any way undermine Canadian occupational health or safety standards.
And just a follow-up, Premier, you spoke about 8% unemployment in the province right now. I guess, are you concerned that this legislation is going to edge those skilled Albertans that are unemployed right now further out of the workforce?
Well, one of the reasons we didn't bring this in last year is because we were still in double-digit unemployment, and really people weren't moving during the first year of COVID. What we're seeing now is a totally different economic situation, and I think we're going to see employment continue to come down. We've seen nearly 60,000 net new jobs created in the past 3 months. Every industry is reporting right across the economy at every skill level problems with getting people to fill jobs. So we need to skate to where the puck is going, and where the puck is growing is dynamic economic growth and labor shortages. I think this is the right time to do it.
And you can go ahead with our last question of the day.
Mirna Jukic, Radio-Canada. Vous avez mentionné que vous voulez aussi réduire les barrières à l'emploi pour les nouveaux arrivants de l'extérieur du pays. Étant donné les pénuries de main-d'œuvre auxquelles on fait face maintenant, pourquoi ne pas les inclure dans cette législation-ci? Qu'est-ce qui doit être différent dans cette approche?
C'est une très bonne question. I'll just summarize in English. The question is, why aren't we doing the same thing for immigrants coming in as opposed to just Canadians? On a déjà adopté une loi à cet égard en 2019 qui s'appelle the Fair Registration Practices Act. Ça fait partie de stratégie de justice pour les nouveaux arrivants, the Fairness for Newcomers Strategy. Et alors, nous avons adopté une loi qui oblige les ordres professionnels de donner une réponse vite, juste et transparente aux demandeurs de reconnaissance de leur titre étranger dès que possible. Et alors, on a créé même un bureau au sein du ministère de ministre Chandreau pour surveiller le progrès des ordres professionnels à cet égard. Et alors, notre stratégie, it's called the Fairness for Newcomer Strategy and the Fair Registration Practices Act. Et écoute, on est ouvert aux mesures supplémentaires à cet égard parce que nous ne voulons pas gaspiller les talents, les habilités des immigrants des autres pays. C'est pour moi le contexte des médecins qui sont chauffeurs de taxi, c'est un scandale moral, un gaspillage économique épouvantable pour le Canada. Il faut le régler. Et nous sommes ouverts aux autres mesures. Effectivement, la semaine dernière, le gouvernement de l'Ontario a déposé un projet de loi pour les mesures sur cet enjeu. Et j'ai demandé à M. Chandreau d'étudier le projet de loi en Ontario pour voir si on peut répliquer certaines de leurs nouvelles politiques à cet égard pour accélérer la reconnaissance des titres étrangers.
You can go ahead with your follow-up.
Si je peux enchaîner sur un sujet un peu différent,
oui.
À l'aube de la session législative, on vous entend beaucoup parler de mesures pour la reprise économique, mais qu'est-ce qu'on peut s'attendre au niveau de la gestion de la pandémie en tant que telle? Est-ce qu'on va voir une levée des restrictions comme l'Ontario en a déjà annoncé? Là?
Écoute, aujourd'hui, nous commençons la session de la législature. Évidemment, la gestion de la crise de santé publique n'est pas vraiment une question de législation, c'est une question opérationnelle pour le ministère de la Santé. On va évidemment, quotidiennement, nous continuer à travailler à cet égard. Nous sommes heureux à voir une diminution de pression sur les hôpitaux et des nombres de nouveaux cas. On va continuer avec les règles que nous avons maintenant dans le contexte de période d'urgence, de crise de santé publique pour les semaines à venir. Le métrique, le nombre que je suis est le nombre total des patients dans les lits de soins intensifs. Il faut que ce nombre-là soit moins de 172. Ça, c'est le nombre normal des lits de soins intensifs. Alors maintenant, nous sommes à, je crois, 270. Alors, il faut voir une diminution dans les semaines à venir dans le nombre des gens dans les soins intensifs avant que nous puissions relaxer les règles de santé publique. So I'll just maybe translate that in English. I was asked in the last question about what we're doing on public health with the fourth wave, which is diminishing. And effectively, I said that that we intend to maintain. First of all, there's really no legislative aspect to the management of COVID at this point. It's an operational and regulatory issue. And we obviously continue to follow things hour by hour. We're happy to see a decline in hospitalizations and in new cases, but we will not be considering a relaxation of public health measures until the total number of intensive care patients is below our baseline of 172. Right now, we're at about 270 to 280. So we will be maintaining our current policy setting with respect to limiting viral spread and, of course, increasing vaccination rates at least until we get to a point where we have sustainable pressure in terms of intensive care in our hospitals. Thank you very much.
Okay, and just a reminder one more time to the media that matters related to the Labor Mobility Act remain under embargo until the legislation is tabled in the Assembly. Thank you.